Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is the News Brief. Today we're going to be talking about the now famous interview that Ben Shapiro had with President Zelensky last week, and how that surprised me, but maybe not in the way you think. And then, of course, we're going to discuss it together in the comments, so you don't have to suffer alone, and I don't have to suffer alone. So, of course, please leave your questions, suggestions, constructive criticism, anything on your mind down below, so I can read it and we can communicate. Let's go. Last week, the now famous interview between Ben Shapiro and President Zelensky dropped on Ben Shapiro's channel. And given that there was already a very conservative far-right commentator coming to Ukraine conducting an interview with President Zelensky, Lex Fridman, I was very skeptical. But hear me out. Lex Fridman came to Ukraine with one goal and one goal in mind only, and that goal was to corner President Zelensky and hopefully give reasoning and value to his agenda. And by his agenda, I mean Lex Fridman's. It's very evident that Lex has a lot of Russophilic views, and he was hoping that he would put President Zelensky into a situation in which he would completely fall flat on his face and Russian propaganda would be flourishing from his answers. However, Lex Fridman, as much as he thinks he's very smart, is kind of dumb. And he's not an intellectual match for Zelensky. So Zelensky ended up eating him alive, and that interview ended up being fantastic for Ukraine, not because Lex is a good interviewer, but because Zelensky is a fantastic interviewee. And of course, he was honest, he was open, and no matter how overplayed and no matter how annoying the questions were, he was answering them earnestly, openly, and honestly. Now, Ben Shapiro, I have to admit, I wasn't quite sure about his views on Ukraine because while they were largely pro-Ukrainian, there were also some sprinkles of very questionable stuff in his previous communications. He is also not dumb. Ben Shapiro is a very good gaslighter. Ben Shapiro is a lawyer. As far as I'm aware, he probably went to Harvard because I do know he said Cambridge educated. Cambridge educated could mean the UK, and Cambridge educated could mean Harvard. In either case, he is a lawyer, and you could tell that he's a lawyer through his debates, for instance, on Jubilee or other channels. Ben Shapiro knows how to take information, dance around it, gaslight you, and be a lawyer. So if he did have very pro-Russian views and came here with an agenda of fulfilling a Russian disinformation campaign, I think Ben Shapiro would have a much easier time in doing so than Lex Fridman. Fast forward, I open his interview, and what I do see on the screen is a very big crash course into Ukrainian history. And that crash course, not just good. I mean, it was very detailed. It was calling out Russia from every single front, aka he mentioned little green men, he mentioned the fact that Russia illegally occupied Ukraine, he mentioned the fact that there were plenty of ceasefires or ceasefire agreements signed, and Russia has backed out of all of them and did not adhere to any of them. So it was a very, very hawkish view on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I was tremendously surprised. Now, it's only part one that has dropped so far, so I can't really, form my opinion, because I can't really form a full opinion because there's part two coming, and what if there is a surprise, which I don't anticipate, to be honest. But the interview itself went very well. Ben Shapiro did ask a lot of really difficult questions. He asked about corruption, he asked about the money coming to Ukraine. However, I mean, that one he was a little uneducated on because he asked about an audit, if there was a possibility of doing an audit, and there are audits being done like every, 3 to 4 months or so. So that is already happening. That is what he didn't know was happening, not that it isn't happening. He also asked what Zelensky thought he could do differently in his Oval Office clash with Donald Trump. And none of these questions really were asked in bad faith. They were asked in pretty good faith. And I was kind of, I was surprised. And it did strike a chord because I didn't expect it. And I usually expect things. It's really a great interview, both from the perspective of both from the perspective of questions asked and from the perspective of answers that were given. Ben Shapiro also followed up the interview by doing a sort of a debrief from his own opinion. He did say that, did I get all of the answers to all of the questions that I asked? It's hard to say because some of these answers are hard to sort of summarize in a single paragraph or in a single sentence. Do I think President Zelensky is being honest and truthful? Yes. He did say one very good thing, that, Americans have this view that if Our allies are not perfect. We should abandon them. He brought up Afghanistan. He brought up a lot of different situations. And he said, you know, we abandoned them because they were far from perfect. And then they really fell into the trap of being taken over by the power that we were trying to fight. And Ukraine isn't perfect. No one's perfect. We're learning, but we should be looking at what the country is striving to become and what the country is doing to become that. He did mention that there were lots of very bad people involved in Afghanistan on both sides, as in like on the sides of Americans and on the sides of Afghanistan being our allies. But that doesn't mean that we should be abandoning our ally and our partner and all of the people involved in it just because there are terrible people present or terrible people involved. That's always going to be the case. No one's perfect and no one's ever going to be perfect. And I think that was a very good summary because that's actually something that me and my co-host Masha from my personal Unmasking podcast that I do outside of news briefs and outside of this job were discussing in a couple of episodes earlier, is that all of the mistakes that the United States have done in Afghanistan and in other countries, they're now repeating with Ukraine. But here, I mean, there is also a twist on it because it's quite clear that there is some Russophilia involved as well. I mean, hey, if you've watched American YouTube, then you would know that some of the House reps and some of the senators have, you know, hammers and sickles and shapko-shankas and Putin's portraits and bears and all of that stuff and souvenirs from Russia literally on display in their offices. So there is a little more than that. That wasn't happening with Afghanistan. Also, Afghanistan wasn't necessarily meddling in disinformation, sending bot farms, and trying to destroy America from within. So a bit more complex than that. You know, that was very simple down. But one thing that really did strike me is Ben Shapiro's attitude to Donald Trump. It's no secret that people like Ben Shapiro, Dave Portnoy, Nick Fuentes, Candace Owens, Joe Rogan, who were really making all of their money on pro-Trump rhetoric and making you and kind of like getting you to vote for Trump. So they made all of their money on getting him elected. Lost a lot of their wealth because of Trump's policies, tariffs, and economic plans. So they have spoken out against him, right? Multiple times at this point, which are the most uncanny people to speak out against him. So, I mean, you really do know that you fucked up when the worst people you know start speaking out against you, especially the people that were your staunchest supporters. So that also echoed his grudge on Trump, and his changed view on Trump's presidency did echo through his interview with Zelensky. Because in the first couple of minutes of the interview, when he was giving a crash course on the invasion of Ukraine, he did also mention that Trump's attitude and policy towards how he handles Ukraine is really wrong. And there are lots of contradictory statements and meltdowns that he's sort of going through on Truth Social that really aren't helping the case and are not good. He did specifically mention that Trump recently said, oh, it's not like I'm forcing Zelensky to recognize Crimea as Russian. And Ben Shapiro called him out because he did say that earlier on Truth Social. Trump did say that, you know, Zelensky refusing to ever recognize Crimea as Russian and verbally consistently repeating it is really bad for the negotiations process, and he was scolding Zelensky. So Shapiro did say, well, if you're not trying to force Zelensky or Ukraine into surrendering Crimea, why is it bad? Why are you talking about Crimea at all? He did call out Trump a couple of times in that segment, and it was very evident that for one, there is a grudge, for two, disappointment, and for three, he really doesn't agree with President Trump's handling of the situation in Ukraine. On multiple other occasions, Ben Shapiro did say that he was against the slow-walking aid to Ukraine that the Biden administration was participating in. So I'm wondering why he is not a lot more outspoken on not the slow walking of aid, but really the blocking of Ukrainian victory and Ukrainian success that's happening on the Trump's administration behalf, or why he isn't calling out the Republicans who were not slow walking aid to Ukraine, but blocking aid to Ukraine during the Biden administration. So all in all, it was a really good interview, and I do recommend that you watch it. It's a very educational, very interesting piece, and Zelensky's answers, as per usual, do shine. However, with all that said, I fully understand how complimentary I was to Ben Shapiro throughout this entire episode. That doesn't change the fact that I think he's a horrendous human being and his views are awful and outdated. You know, he's one of those people who thinks that a woman who was essayed or sexually assaulted and got pregnant should give birth no matter what. He's one of those people who's advocated to implement laws that now result in deaths of American women. He is, a patron of patriarchy. He's a patron of conservatism. He's a patron of somehow installing theocracy in the United States, even though he himself is Jewish. And he hates DEI and everything that it stands for and represents, yet DEI also includes him being able to wear a yarmulke or a kippah and not be judged for it. Anyways, very contradictory. And I do think that Ben Shapiro is very smart, and, the question stands, how can someone who's this smart vote for Trump, right? He must not be that smart. No, he must be smart, because what he thought was going to happen is that he was going to be the exception, just like Joe Rogan, Dave Portnoy, and other people who were supporting Trump, right? Which, by the way, all of those people have Slavic roots except for Nick Fuentes and Candace Owens. Funny. Anyways, so Ben Shapiro thought that he was going to accumulate a ridiculous amount of wealth by supporting Trump. And then those policies kind of hit him in the face, because he did realize that he's just like everyone else, not Trump's billionaires, and he's going to continue losing money with Trump's policies and presidency. And that's all I have for you for today. So if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and also your notification bell so you don't miss when the next episodes come out. Like this episode, send it to a friend, and leave a comment, write a line. Tell me how you feel, tell me what you thought, and I will see you next time.